Now, why didn't the Petrograd Soviet take power? They had Order Number 1 is issued, but they didn't attempt to take control. That's where they said they had power over the military. The workers and soldiers of Russia saw the Petrograd Soviet as their sort of central representative to whom they sent representatives. They saw it as more legitimate than the provisional government, which was upper class, maybe detached from them and had appointed themselves. But the Petrograd Soviet didn't feel it was time to take power, or maybe they were cautious in seizing power. Now, there is Sukhanov's view on page 190 in Waller 6.3, and I'll read that to you. Nikolai Sukhanov, an early Soviet leader, later gave his view on why the Soviet did not take control. Our revolution lacked both the material power and the indispensable prerequisites for an immediate socialist transformation of Russia. The Soviet democracy had to entrust the power to the propertied elements, its class enemy, without whose participation it could not now master the technique of administration, nor deal with the forces of Tsarism and the bourgeoisie united against it. So that was his view. They weren't really quite ready. So there were two powers, two governments, dual power, one on one side of the palace you see here, and one on this side of the palace, the Tauride palace that you see here, and they're both sharing power in Russia. Now, according to Waller on page 190, the Soviet leadership of the Petrograd Soviet actually feared the responsibility of governing. So an interesting view in that way. In the terms of dual power, in order to get it, the provisional government granted to Russia a general amnesty for political prisoners, something I mentioned before that was very popular. They gave basic civil liberties, things like freedom of the press. There was an abolition of legal inequalities based on class, religion, and nationality. The people of Russia were given the right to organize trade unions. They also met during the day with their workers' committee and things in the factory. There was also the promise of a constituent assembly to write a new constitution, which is essentially the rules for the country. So how would they set up the country? How would power to be divided? What responsibilities would there be? That was going to be written by this new body called the Constituent Assembly. Now, the Petrograd Soviet did not challenge the authority of the provisional government. Now, the Petrograd provisional government had some support from the masses, but you need to remember they did not push for land reform, and in part this was because they didn't have the legal right to do so. They had not been elected. They didn't feel it was right to do so. There's also the fact that members of the provisional government and groups they represented didn't want their land taken away or redistributed. And so this is what existed during the period of dual authority. Now, there were problems between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. One was that they had different visions of the future for Russia. One, with the Petrograd Soviet, is looking for a peoples-based or a peasant-based change, maybe even as far as an abolition of banks and maybe personal property and nationalizing land. One must also remember the provisional government did not have traditional means of controlling opposition. They got rid of the police. And also with Order Number 1, they did not have ultimate control of the military if things got ugly. And they also had that unpopular decision to continue the war. And a result of that we can see in the picture right here. So, problems with the provisional government? They tried to satisfy both the upper and lower classes in Russia and managed to satisfy neither, as you've seen in your reading. There was a feeling the provisional government was moving to the left with changes in leadership, so the right and the moderates weren't as happy. And with the unpopular war effort, this could be seen in terms of desertions. And this picture that you can see right above me here is of two deserters being threatened by another soldier. From 1914 to 1917, there's a record of 195,000 desertions from the army, while from March to May 1917, 365,000. In part, that's due to the unpopularity of the war. It's also due in part because peasants were hearing that land was being taken over by local people, taken away from landowners, and they didn't want to miss out on the chance to get land for themselves. Now, things deteriorated for the provisional government, and they launched a very unpopular June offensive to try and push the German forces out of Russia. You remember that from an earlier screencast. They captured hundreds of kilometers of Russia. And this offensive ended in a disaster with 60,000 killed. There were demonstrations in the street by workers, sailors, and soldiers. Here you can see some pictures of some of the rioting going on in Petrograd. The people lying down have been shot as they're trying to disperse the riots. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks were blamed. Not so much because they organized it. Some say they tried to take advantage of it once it was happening. But Lenin and the other leaders definitely knew that this was not the time to have a revolution. They did not have the support. They did not have the organization. So it was not the time to have a coup and take over the government. But because the Bolsheviks were blamed by Kerensky, they were outlawed and driven underground due to that blame. Lenin fled. And now, at this point, in the July days of 1917, it appears the Bolsheviks are on their way out. And so that comes to the question, are they done?